The first time I noticed something was wrong at my lakeside property was during my spring visit last year. The property has been in my family for 4 generations. My grandfather, James Mitchell, built the original cabin with his own hands back in the 1940s, and though we've modernized it over the years, it's still a modest place compared to some of the McMansions that have popped up around Cedar Lake recently. I'm a real estate attorney by trade, Robert Mitchell, but everyone around the lake just calls me Rob, which has made me particularly careful about property lines and documentation. When my father passed the property to me 15 years ago, I immediately had a proper survey done and filed all the paperwork with the county. I visit about once a month during the summer and a few times during the off-season to check on things and do maintenance. It's going to be my retirement home someday, so I take good care of it. The property next door had changed hands about 6 months before my spring visit. The previous owners were the Hendersons, an elderly couple who'd been there even longer than my family. They were wonderful neighbors, quiet, respectful, and always willing to keep an eye on my place when I wasn't around. When they decided to move to be closer to their grandkids in Florida, I was sad to see them go. The new owners were from the city, the Blackwells. I'd heard through the local grapevine that he was some kind of finance executive and she, Karen, didn't work. The moment they signed the papers, they immediately started renovations on the house, turning what had been a charming lakeside cottage into something that looked like it belonged in an architectural magazine. All winter I'd been hearing from other neighbors about the constant construction, the complaints about contractors, and the general disruption they were causing. Old Mr. Thompson, who lived across the cove, had already had 3 run-ins with Karen about his unsightly fishing gear visible from her deck. The Wilsons, a young family with 3 kids, had been lectured about their children's laughter carrying across the water. Still, I wasn't prepared for what I found that April weekend when I drove up for my first visit of the season. There, straddling the property line between my land and theirs, was a partially constructed detached garage. And not just any garage. This was a massive structure that looked like it could house a small yacht. The worst part, at least a third of it was clearly on my property. I parked my Subaru and walked over to inspect the construction more closely. The concrete foundation had been poured, and framing was underway. I took out my phone and started taking photos, my blood pressure rising with each shot. As I was documenting the encroachment, a shiny black Range Rover with personalized plates, CAR NB 2022, pulled into the neighboring driveway. A woman stepped out, dressed in what I could tell were expensive casual clothes, designer jeans, a cashmere sweater, and oversized sunglasses perched on her head like a crown. "Can I help you?" she called out, her tone immediately suspicious, as if I was the trespasser. I introduced myself as her neighbor and the owner of the property. "Oh, you're the one with the little cabin," she said, looking past me toward my modest place with barely concealed disdain. Her perfectly manicured hand gestured dismissively. "I'm surprised we haven't met before." "I don't live here full-time yet," I explained, "but I do own this property, and I couldn't help but notice that your new garage is partially on my land." She laughed, a short, dismissive sound that echoed across the water. Several ducks took flight. "Oh, that? It's just a small strip of land. It's not like you're using it for anything." "Whether I'm using it or not isn't relevant," I said, trying to keep my tone even. "It's my property." She waved her hand dismissively. "The Hendersons told us we could use that area. They said it was fine." "Did you get that in writing?" I asked. Her expression hardened, perfectly sculpted eyebrows drawing together. "We had a verbal agreement. Besides, we need somewhere to store our boats and jet skis. Do you know how much we paid for our house? This garage will increase your property value too. You should be thanking us." I took a deep breath. 20 years of legal practice had taught me how to deal with entitled people, but this was testing my limits. "I'd like to see your building permits and the survey you used for this construction." "I don't have to show you anything," she snapped. "My husband handles all of that. He'll be home this evening." "I'd be happy to discuss this with both of you," I said, "but construction needs to stop until we sort this out." "Good luck with that," she said, turning to walk away. "The contractors are coming back tomorrow. I spent the rest of the day looking through my own documentation and contacting the county offices. By evening, I had confirmed what I already knew. The property line was exactly where I remembered it, and their garage was definitely encroaching by nearly 12 feet. Around 7:00 p.m., I walked back over, this time finding both Karen and a man I assumed was her husband, Richard, at home. I introduced myself again. "My wife mentioned you had some concerns about the garage," he said, his tone more professional than hers had been. "I'm sure we can work something out." I showed him the property survey and explained the situation. He looked at it with a frown. "Our contractor assured us this was within our property line," he said. "Did you get a survey done before you started building?" I asked. "We used the markers that were already there," Karen cut in. "Besides, like I told you, the Hendersons said we could use that area." "Even if they did, which I doubt, knowing them, verbal agreements about land use don't carry over when property changes hands," I explained. "And they certainly don't override legal property lines." Richard, at least, had the decency to look concerned. "What are you suggesting we do?" "The simplest solution would be to modify the plans and move the portion that's on my property," I said. "I understand you've already put money into this, and I don't want to cause unnecessary hardship." Karen stepped forward, her face flushing. "Do you have any idea how much that would cost? We're not changing anything. This is just a petty neighborhood squabble. If you were here full time, maybe you'd have more say, but you're barely even using the property." "That's not how property ownership works," I said, my patience wearing thin. "I'm trying to be reasonable here." "But reasonable would be minding your own business," she interrupted. "Our house is worth 3 times what your little cabin is. We're improving the whole area." "I think we should consult our attorney," Richard said, putting a hand on Karen's arm. "Go ahead," I said, "but I'm also going to file a formal complaint with the county about the unpermitted construction." "Are you threatening us?" Karen demanded. "No, I'm informing you of my next steps if we can't resolve this amicably," I replied. "You'll be hearing from our lawyer," she said, "and good luck making any friends around here after this. You know people talk." As I walked back to my cabin, I could hear her voice carrying across the yard, still berating me. The next morning, construction continued as if our conversation had never happened. I filed my complaint with the county building department and called my own lawyer, Dave, who had been a friend since law school. He confirmed what I already knew. I was completely within my rights to demand they remove the portion of the structure on my property. Over the next few weeks, things escalated. While I was away, they'd apparently decided to take additional liberties with my property. When I returned for my next visit, I discovered they'd cut down 2 mature maple trees on my side of the line, claiming they blocked their view. They'd also extended their dock in a way that made it difficult for me to access part of my own waterfront. Their parties became increasingly frequent and loud, with guests parking on the edge of my property without permission. When I asked them to have their friends park elsewhere, Karen, who by now had heard other neighbors referring to as the entitled city lady, told me I was being ridiculous about a little strip of grass. I sent a formal cease and desist letter, which she dramatically tore up in front of several other neighbors, while loudly proclaiming that I was ruining the community spirit of the lake. The final straw came when I discovered they'd installed security cameras pointed at my property. When I asked about them, she claimed they were for security, but with a smirk that suggested intimidation was the real purpose. Throughout all of this, I documented everything meticulously: photos, videos, dates, times, and witnesses. I'd also been talking with other neighbors and discovered I wasn't their only target. They'd been making demands about boat noise, fishing too close to their water, and even complaining about children being too loud at the public beach. My lawyer filed all the necessary paperwork, and we requested an emergency hearing with the county. The building inspector came out and confirmed the encroachment, issuing a stop work order that they promptly ignored. The inspector added fines for continuing construction without addressing the violations, but they seemed unfazed by this. Apparently, money was no object. After 2 months of this back and forth with no resolution, I decided more decisive action was needed. My lawyer assured me that with all the documentation and official findings, I was within my legal rights to remove structures encroaching on my property, provided I didn't damage any portion that was on their land. I waited until a weekend when I knew they would be away. They'd made quite a show of telling everyone about their trip to some exclusive resort in the Maldives. I hired a reputable demolition company that specialized in precise removals, making sure they understood exactly where the property line was. On a quiet Saturday morning, the crew arrived with their equipment. Several longtime neighbors came over to watch, offering coffee and moral support. Old Mr. Thompson, who'd lived on the lake for 60 years, sat in a lawn chair, grinning from ear to ear. "Been waiting to see someone stand up to those two," he told me. "They tried to tell me my boat was unsightly and should be kept in storage when not in use, on a lake where I've lived since before they were born. The demolition was precise and professional. Only the portion of the garage that encroached on my land was removed, leaving a clean cut exactly at the property line. The crew also installed boundary markers, and at my lawyer's suggestion, a row of small but visible no trespassing signs. I had my own security cameras installed, properly positioned to monitor only my property. As a final touch, I had a surveyor come out and paint a bright line marking the exact property boundary. Everything was done by the book, with proper permits and documentation. 3 days later, I was sitting on my porch, drinking my morning coffee, when I heard the unmistakable sound of their Range Rover returning. There was a moment of silence, then a scream so loud it probably scared fish in the middle of the lake. What happened to my garage? I remained on my porch, sipping my coffee, as Karen stormed toward my property, her husband hurrying behind her. "What did you do?" she shrieked, stopping at the newly marked property line, her face contorted with rage. "I removed the portion of your structure that was on my property," I said calmly, as I'm legally entitled to do. "You had no right," she screamed. "We're calling the police. You're going to jail for this." "Feel free to call them," I replied. "I have all the documentation right here, including the building inspector's report confirming the encroachment." Her husband was on his phone, presumably calling the police, while she continued to berate me with language that would make a sailor blush. At one point, she stepped over the property line, and I calmly warned her that she was trespassing. "It's my land," she screamed, taking another step forward. "It's not, and I have the survey to prove it," I said, "and you're now trespassing, which is on video." I pointed to my new security camera. That stopped her momentarily, but her tirade continued from just on her side of the line. By now, several other neighbors had emerged to watch the spectacle, some not even bothering to hide their amusement. When the police arrived about 20 minutes later, Karen immediately demanded they arrest me for destruction of property. The officers, both of whom looked like they'd seen it all, asked to see my documentation. I provided everything: the original survey, the building inspector's report, the cease and desist letters, the legal opinions, and video evidence of the continued construction despite official orders to stop. "Ma'am," one officer finally said to her, "based on these documents, your structure was encroaching on this property, and the owner took legal action to remove the encroachment after proper notification." "That's impossible," she insisted. "We had permission." "From whom?" the officer asked. "The previous owners," she said. "Do you have that in writing?" "We didn't need it in writing. It was a neighbor agreement." The officer sighed. "Ma'am, verbal agreements about land use don't transfer with property ownership, and they don't override legal property lines. From what I can see, no crime has been committed here." "This is ridiculous," she screamed. "Do you know who my husband is?" Richard, who had been relatively quiet, finally stepped forward. "Let's just go inside and call our lawyer," he said, clearly embarrassed by the scene his wife was creating. "No, I want this man arrested now," she demanded. "There are no grounds for an arrest," the officer stated firmly. "This appears to be a civil matter that has already been addressed through proper legal channels. I suggest you consult with your attorney if you wish to pursue it further." As they were speaking, the county building inspector arrived. Apparently, one of the neighbors had called him too. He reviewed the situation and informed the couple that they were still in violation of building codes and now had an unsafe structure that would need to be properly addressed. And you'll need to apply for new permits if you want to rebuild, he added. Your current permits are being revoked due to the violations. By this point, Karen was beyond reasoning with. She stormed back to their house, screaming about lawsuits and ruined weekends. Richard lingered behind. This isn't over, he said, but without much conviction. It could have been resolved months ago if you'd simply acknowledged the property line and adjusted your plans, I pointed out. He had no response to that and finally followed his wife back to their house. Over the next few weeks, I received multiple threats of lawsuits, none of which materialized. Their lawyer, after reviewing all the documentation, apparently advised them that they had no case. They were forced to properly demolish the remaining portion of the garage and clean up the site, incurring additional expenses and fines from the county. What they didn't expect was the community response. While I had been the main target of their entitlement, many other neighbors had their own stories. Once one person stood up to them, others found their courage too. The local lake association, which I hadn't even known existed, called a special meeting to address community standards of behavior. Without naming names, they established new guidelines about respecting property boundaries, permitting requirements, and noise levels. The message was clear. The entitled newcomers needed to adapt to the lake community, not the other way around. The Blackwells' social standing around the lake plummeted. Invitations to community events mysteriously stopped arriving. People were polite but distant. Their parties became smaller and less frequent as fewer people accepted their invitations. About 6 months after the garage incident, a for sale sign appeared in front of their house. I later heard through the real estate grapevine that they sold for considerably less than they'd invested, given all the half-completed renovations and the now public knowledge of their boundary issues. The new owners, a retired couple with grandchildren, have been wonderful neighbors. Before they even moved in, they came over to introduce themselves and asked for a copy of my survey to make sure they understood the property boundaries correctly. We don't want any misunderstandings, the husband told me with a knowing smile. We heard about what happened with the previous owners. The garage was eventually rebuilt, completely on their property, with proper permits and at a more reasonable size. They even consulted with me about the design to make sure it wouldn't block my view of the lake. As for me, I've gained a certain reputation around the lake as someone who knows property law and isn't afraid to stand up for what's right. Several neighbors have consulted me about their own boundary questions, and I've been happy to help. Last summer, I was elected president of the Lake Association, a position I never sought but have come to enjoy. We've established a more formal process for welcoming new property owners, which includes providing information about local ordinances, community expectations, and yes, the importance of respecting property boundaries. I still think about Karen sometimes, especially when I'm sitting on my dock, watching the sunset over the peaceful lake. The property line is now marked with a row of beautiful native flowering shrubs, my idea, planted with permission on both sides of the boundary. They serve as a gentle but clear reminder of where one property ends and another begins. Old Mr. Thompson brought me a bottle of his homemade blackberry wine after the Blackwells moved out. Been waiting 40 years to see something like that. He chuckled as he handed it over. Thanks for standing up, not just for yourself, but for all of us. We shared that bottle on my dock, swapping stories about the lake's history and the characters who'd come and gone over the decades. His final words that evening stuck with me. You know what the difference is between having rights and protecting them, he asked, actually knowing what they are and being willing to defend them when it counts. I couldn't have said it better myself. Sometimes teaching someone a lesson isn't about revenge. It's about maintaining the boundaries that allow everyone to be good neighbors. In the end, I didn't just protect my property. I helped preserve the character of a community that had welcomed my family for generations. And that's worth far more than a strip of land or the satisfaction of watching an entitled person have a meltdown when they finally face consequences for their actions. Though I have to admit, that part was pretty satisfying too.